the basis for the treatment that occurs in a water resource recovery facility is partly physical and partly biological. The initial step is a liquid-solid separation that happens in a clarifier, where everything that's heavier than water settles to the bottom and the water remains at the top. There are certain things like grease that are lighter than water, have a lower specific or a bulk density than water. They will float to the top and can be removed. That stuff is sent to the digester. The settled material is sent to the digester. The streams are separated at that point. Liquid goes into liquid treatment stream, solids go for solids processing. The liquid treatment stream is biological in nature. The aeration tanks, most modern plants are based on the activated sludge technology, and activated sludge is a microbial community. It's bacteria, single cell organisms, things that you need to look at through a microscope to see or identify are called microbes. They're little plants and animals, and they use those nutrients that are in the wastewater stream as a food source. So in the same way that when you eat a plate of supper, that food enters your body, you create energy from it, you create heat from it, and you create respiration byproducts from it. So the air that you're breathing out, the warmth that you experience in your body, and the way that you sustain your body mass, those microbes are doing the same thing with those nutrients that they use as food. And then at the end of the process, because there's food available, because they want to reproduce and sustain themselves, they excrete a mass that's it's a biological mass called a zooglial mass, or a flock in the activated sludge process where they live. So they create their own living environment, and they sustain their own body mass, and they reproduce exponentially more and more and more of those same microbes, because the environment is created for them to be ideal for them. So periodically you remove some of that material, which includes those microbes and their living environment. That flock settles out in a second stage, a secondary clarifier, and a portion of it is diverted off, which also goes to digestion, and it becomes part of the solid stream that's recovered for both biosolids as NASM or fertilizer, where biosolids is a source material. But to think that what that fertilizer represents is still the incoming sewage solid, part of which is human waste, is completely wrong. Fertilizer commodities where biosolids is a source material get targeted in conversations around things like PFAS compounds. It's partly because of that original yuck or ick factor that people have, partly because they have no understanding of what happens in a modern resource recovery facility, how materials are treated, decomposed by the biological community that is cultured and resides there, very similar to what happens in composting, which people tend to be more familiar with, but they don't know what happens in a plant, so they can't really get their head around how this product can be different and safe and clean and useful. There are other examples, though, of how wastewater treatment plants are targeted. When Lake Erie was facing year after year after year of algae blooms, and blue-green algae, which is toxic and really limited the fishery. Lake Erie is an important fishery, the recreational opportunities there. They realized that the contributing waters, the runoff, which was feeding Lake Erie, was high in phosphates. And that's what was feeding that algae and creating those algae blooms. So they said, well, what can we do to limit that? And so they put strict requirements on every wastewater treatment plant that fed every stream that went into Lake Erie, regulated them down to 0.03 parts per million on phosphorus on their discharge, and said, okay, that's going to clean up the lake. Well, it was easy to pass those laws. They were a target. It was easy to have a press release that said, we've done something to solve the problem. But guess what? 15 years later, millions of dollars were spent in those treatment plants to treat to those extremely low levels, and it turns out it didn't make any difference. They still have the algae blooms, they still have the same amount of phosphate or phosphorus going into the lake because it comes from forests, it comes from agriculture, it comes from tile drains, it comes from everything that contributes in that watershed. And the percentage of what comes from a wastewater treatment plant in that watershed is minuscule. It didn't have the desired effect. The same thing is going to be true if they have a knee-jerk reaction that's not based on science and they regulate a pharmaceutical compound or a PFAS compound and put a moratorium in place or prohibit marketing. It won't have the desired effect. It only creates, something for a good news story or a news article.